everyone to our chapter book read along of Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We are reading this wonderful book by C.S. Lewis, and I want to remind us what we have read so far in our story before we get into our next chapters. So, let's do a quick review. We meet the four children of our story: Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. They are siblings who lived in London during World War II time and are taken out of the city so that they can be safe from the war. They go to a large old house way out in the country that is owned by a professor. Now, in this house, they explore some of the really cool places. There's so many rooms, so many things to see. While exploring, the youngest, Lucy, finds a snowy forest inside of a wardrobe in a spare room. It is Narnia, and inside she meets Mr. Tumnus, who is a faun. He befriends her and takes her to his house where they have tea and a very good evening. Well, Mr. Tumnus tells her all about the White Witch. She has cursed Narnia with an eternal winter and no Christmas. What's the point of winter? But she told everyone that if they saw a human, they had to bring him or her to the queen. Well, Mr. Tumnus decided to go against that, and he is going to protect Lucy and took her back to the lamppost, which is right outside of the wardrobe. She made it back and went back home. When she gets back home, no time has passed from between the time she went into the wardrobe to when she got back. And her siblings do not believe her that Narnia is inside this wardrobe. They go and they look, and it's just a regular wardrobe. Well, during another day where they're stuck inside and not able to play outside, they play a game of hide and seek, and Lucy again looks for Narnia. She finds it, and her brother Edmund follows her this time. Well, Edmund had been trying to catch her in the act and has been kind of being not very nice about the whole situation. So he followed her in and found Narnia as well. There he met the Queen of Narnia, who's actually the White Witch. And she gave him food and drink and promised him lots of things, like more food and drink, and that he could be king of Narnia above all of his siblings, if he brought them to her. So, the last thing she said is, keep it a surprise. Don't tell your siblings that you've met me and that you are going to bring them to me. Well, Lucy finds Edmund, and she is so excited that he has seen Narnia as well. And she reminds him that there is a scary woman that calls herself the Queen of Narnia, who's actually the White Witch and has cursed these lands. Well, they head back and are excited, well, at least Lucy is, excited to tell their other siblings about that they have both found this cool place. Let's see what happens next in our next chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Enjoy! Chapter 5, Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out. Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it. What's this all about, Ed? Said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right. But he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. Tell us, Ed, said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy, There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success, and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going silly in the head or else turning into the most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next?" I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of what to say. "You didn't think anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that they found Lucy. A good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing that they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he'd expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage, talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning, they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to Father if he thinks there really is something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them, and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said that they had only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which is more truthful?" "That's the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up till now, I'd have said Lucy every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That's more than I know," said the professor. "And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed." "We're afraid it might not even be lying," said Susan. "We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean?" said the professor quite coolly. "Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she's not mad." "But then," said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. "Logic," said the professor, half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know that she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth." Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how can it be true, sir?" said Peter. "Why would you say that?" asked the professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was really, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing in there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was." "What has that to do with it?" said the professor. "Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time." "Are they?" said the professor, and Peter did not know what to say. "But there was no time," said Lucy. "Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended she had been gone away for hours." "That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true," said the professor. "If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If, I say, she had got into another world, I should not be at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that, however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden it for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story." "Do you really mean it, sir," said Peter, "that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner, like that?" "Nothing is more probable," said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, "I wonder what they do teach them in these schools." "But what are we to do?" said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. "My dear young lady," said the professor, suddenly looking up at them with a very sharp expression, "there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying." "What is that?" "You might try minding your own business," said he, and that was the end of that conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so, for a time, it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it. It was the sort of house that was mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children, and did not like being interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter, almost the first morning, along with a good many of other instructions, "And please remember, you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party all over the house." "Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a crowd of strange grown-ups," said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventure began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it into bits, when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out! Here comes the Macready and a whole gang with her." "Shop's the word," said Peter, and all four made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they got into the green room, and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them, and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs, instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers! Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment that they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door. And then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else." And he flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside it and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for, of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Chapter 6. Into the Forest. "I wish the Macready would hurry up and take these people away," said Susan presently. "I'm getting horribly cramped." "And what a filthy smell of camphor," said Edmund. "I expect the pockets of these coats are full of it," said Susan, "to keep away moths." "There's something sticking into my back," said Peter. "And isn't it cold?" said Susan. "Now that you mention it, it is cold," said Peter. "And hang it all, it's wet too. What's the matter with this place? I'm sitting on something wet. It's getting wetter every minute." He struggled to his feet. "Let's get out," said Edmund. "They're gone." Oh, said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what's the matter. "I'm sitting against a tree," said Susan. "And look, it's getting light over there." "By Jove, you're right," said Peter. "And look there, and there. It's trees all around, and this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we've gone into Lucy's wood after all." And now there was no mistaking it, and all four children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them were coats hanging on pegs. In front of them were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. "I apologize for not believing you," he said. "I'm sorry. Will you shake hands?" "Of course," said Lucy, and did. "And now," said Susan, "what do we do next?" "Do?" said Peter. "Why, go and explore the wood, of course." "Oh," said Susan, stamping her feet. "It's pretty cold. What about putting on some of these coats?" "They're not ours," said Peter doubtfully. "I'm sure no one would mind," said Susan. "It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We shan't even be taking them out of the wardrobe." "I've never thought of that, Sue," said Peter. "Of course, now that you put it that way. I see. No one could say that you bagged a coat as long as it didn't even leave the wardrobe where you found it. And suppose this whole country is the wardrobe." They immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so that they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than coats when they had put them on. But they all felt a good deal warmer, and each thought the others looked better in their new get-ups and more suitable for the landscape. "We can pretend we're Arctic explorers," said Lucy. "This is going to be exciting enough without pretending," said Peter, as he began leading the way into the forest. There were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked as if there might be more snow before tonight. "I say," began Edmund presently, "oughtn't we be bearing a bit more to the left, that is, if we're aiming for the lamp-post?" He had forgotten for the moment that he must pretend never to have been in the wood before. The moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized that he had given himself away. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared at him, and Peter whistled. "So you really were here," he said. "That time Lou said she'd met you here, you made out like she was telling lies." There was a dead silence. "Of all the poisonous little beasts," said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed indeed no more to say, and presently the four resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, "I'll pay you all out for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied pigs." "Where are we going anyway?" said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. "I think Lou ought to be the leader," said Peter. "Goodness knows she deserves it. Where will you take us, Lou?" "What about going to see Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "He's the nice fawn I told you about." Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. Lucy proved a good leader. At first, she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree on one place and a stump in another, and brought them to where the ground became uneven and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there was a terrible surprise waiting for them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside, the cave was dark and cold and had a damp feel and the smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in from the doorway and was heaped on the floor, mixed with something black, which turned out to be charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung it about the room and then stamped it out. The crockery lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been smashed into shreds with a knife. "This is a pretty good washout," said Edmund. "No much good coming here." "What is this?" said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet into the floor. "Is there anything written on it?" asked Susan. "Yes, I think there is," answered Peter, "but I can't read it in this light. Let's go out into the open air." They all went out into the daylight and crowded round Peter as he read out the following words. "The former occupant of these premises, the Fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting his trial on the charge of high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia, Chatelaine of Cab Paravel, Empress of the Lone Islands, etc., also for comforting her and Majesty's enemies, harboring spies, and fraternizing with humans. Signed, Morgrim, Captain of the Secret Police. Long live the Queen." The children stared at each other. "I don't know that I'm going to like this place after all," said Susan. "Who is this Queen, Lou?" said Peter. "Do you know anything about her?" "She's not a real queen at all," answered Lucy. "She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people, hate her. She has made an enchantment over the whole country so that it is always winter here and never Christmas." I wonder if there's any point in going on," said Susan. "I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it looks as if though it won't be much fun either, and it's getting colder every minute, and we've brought nothing to eat. What about just going home?" "Oh, but we can't," said Lucy suddenly. "Don't you see? We can't just go home, not after this. It's all on my account that the poor fawn has gotten into trouble. He hid me from the witch and showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the Queen's enemies and fraternizing with humans. We simply must try to rescue him." "A lot we could do," said Edmund, "when we haven't even got anything to eat." "Shut up, you," said Peter, who was still very angry at Edmund. "What do you think, Susan?" "I have a horrid feeling that Lou is right," said Susan. "I don't want to get a step further, and I wish we'd never come. But I think we must try to do something for Mr. whatever his name is. The fawn." "That's what I feel too," said Peter. "I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting into this country again once you've got out of it. I think we've got to go on." "So do I," said both of the girls. "If only we knew where the poor chap was imprisoned," said Peter. They all were still wondering what to do next, when Lucy said, "Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder, can birds talk in Narnia? It almost looks as if he wanted to say something to us." Then she turned to the robin and said, "Please, can you tell us where Mr. Tumnus the fawn has been taken to?" As she said this, she took a step toward the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as the next tree. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as if it understood all that they had been saying. Almost without noticing that they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer to it. At this once the robin flew away again to the next tree, and once more looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder chest or a brighter eye. "Do you know," said Lucy, "I really believe he means us to follow him." "I've an idea he does," said Susan. "What do you think, Peter?" "Well, we might as well try it," answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow it. In this way, it led them on, slightly downhill. Wherever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently, the clouds parted overhead, and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzlingly bright. They had been traveling in this way for about half an hour, with the two girls in front, when Edmund said to Peter, "If you're not still too high-minded to talk to me, I've something to say which you'd better listen to." "What is it?" asked Peter. "Hush, not so loud," said Edmund. "There's no good frightening the girls, but if you realize what we're doing—" "What?" said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We're following a guide we know nothing about. How do we know which side that bird is on? Why shouldn't it be leading us to a trap?" "That's a nasty idea. Still, a robin, you know. They're good birds in all the stories I've read," said Peter. "I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side." "If it comes to that, which is the right side? How do we know that the fawns are in the right and the queen, yes, I know, we've been told she's a witch, is in the wrong?" "We don't really know anything either," said Edmund. "The fawn saved Lucy." "He said he did, but how do we know? And there's another thing too. Has anyone the least idea a way home from here?" "Great Scott," said Peter. "I haven't thought of that." "And no chance of dinner either," said Edmund. Let's discuss our chapters. So we read chapter 5, which is titled Back on This Side of the Door. When did Edmund decide what he was going to do? Not until he was standing right in front of his older siblings. How much older than Lucy is Edmund? They said just about 1 year, so not that much older, even though he pretends he's older. And what did Edmund say when Peter and Susan asked if he had found Narnia as well? He said, "Nope, we were just pretending. It's all a silly game. I was indulging her." And of course, it made Lucy upset because he lied. Ugh. How did Peter say Edmund had always behaved? He was not always nice to things or people that are smaller than him, is how Peter put it. What did Peter and Susan decide to do about their concern over Lucy? They wanted to go and talk to the professor. He is a smart guy and has lived in this house for a long time, and they think they need some adult help. How did the professor respond to their account of Lucy's story? Definitely not what Susan and Peter thought he would say, right? He said, "Oh, well, why don't you think it's true? She's always been a truthful person in the past, right?" What is the main reason Susan and Peter didn't believe Lucy? It seems odd, right? It's not something that usually happens. I've seen a lot of wardrobes and things. I've never seen a magical land inside of them. It seems way out there. But what did Professor say were the only 3 logical possibilities? Either she's lying, she is going a little, maybe stir crazy, and making up stories, and thinks it's real, or she's telling the truth. What did he advise them to do? I like this. He said, "Mind your own business." He said, "You can worry about your sister, that's fine, but is this hurting you? No. This is her thing, You don't need to keep concerning yourself unless it really starts hurting her. And it's not. So they all get along a lot better after they start minding their own business, don't they? What is something that's unusual about the professor's house? It is kind of famous, right? So people from all over the countryside and the country and the world would come and visit it and take tours of this house. So what happens is they're taking tours and the kids have to hide. All right, I have a couple thinking questions. You ready? From this chapter. Why do you think Peter reacted as he did to Edmund? Well, I would be a little frustrated with my sibling too, especially if he was picking on the youngest one as the youngest sibling. But I think it's because he's seen Edmund pick on younger people before, and because before he went into Narnia, Edmund had been the one who was provoking Lucy the most and picking on her about it. And if Edmund had been telling the truth, which he hadn't, just him, indulging her and being even more kind of pushy with it made Peter really upset because that wasn't very fair to Lucy. Why do you think the professor was willing to believe Lucy's story? Well, they said that she's truthful. And, he's lived in that house a long time. I wonder if he's seen some things. Our last thinking question for this chapter. What do you think of his statement that nothing is more probable than that there could be other worlds just around the corner? I don't think it's possible in our world, but definitely in theirs. I think that he may have seen something before, and so he really thinks it's probable. We'll see. All right, chapter 6, which is called Into the Forest. What were the first clues that something strange was happening inside the wardrobe? First clues. Well, Peter's like, why am I sitting in something wet? Just kind of weird inside a wardrobe. And that it was cold, and suddenly Susan was sitting on a tree. It was all very uncomfortable. So our next question is, how did the coats look on the siblings? They were really, really long. So none of them quite fit right. They were big and long and went all the way down to their feet. And they said they looked like royal robes. How did Edmund give away the fact that he had been to Narnia before? He said, shouldn't we be going toward the lamppost? Which just made Peter a little more frustrated because he'd been lying again. What did the children find at Mr. Tumnus's house in his cave? It was a mess, a wreck. Mr. Tumnus's house was trashed. Things were broken. Everything was all messed up. The door was broken off the hinges. And they found a little letter, didn't they? Inside from the secret police. Do you remember who signed it? Who was the secret police? Said his name is Morgrim. That doesn't sound great. Here's a picture of Mr. Tumnus's house. Doesn't look good. Uh-oh. Why did the siblings decide not just to go home? Well, as Lucy put it, Mr. Tumnus was kidnapped and captured because of them, because of helping Lucy and being kind to her. So she, kind of takes responsibility for that, and him being her friend, she wants to go and help him, see if they can find him. What was Peter worried about? Well, the fact that they didn't have any food. They went in kind of unprepared, right? So if you're going on a camping trip or maybe hiking through the woods, you would be prepared. So you'd have some water bottles, you'd have nice boots. They had to borrow coats from the wardrobe, which I love that they said they never actually took them out of the wardrobe. It's still in it. I think that's funny. So I would be a little worried too. They had no snacks, no food. But what did Edmund suggest about the robin that they were following through the woods? He was worried that it was working for the wrong people. Edmund was suspicious. But why did Peter decide to trust the bird? He said that, seemed nice. Usually robins are trustworthy. I don't know. All right, here's our 2 thinking questions for this chapter. Why do you think Edmund had such a bad attitude? Well, he had been found out about his lies, didn't he? So I don't think his siblings are all very happy with him. He was cold, just kind of grumpy, and maybe his plan to get them to the Queen is not going very well. Do you agree with the children's decision to try and rescue Mr. Tumnus? I do. I think that he really helped Lucy and that they should, help their friends. Problem is, I don't think they quite know what they're in for. That's the one thing that I'm a little worried about them with. So we'll see how that goes. All right. Those are our discussion questions for these chapters. I hope you have enjoyed so far what we've read in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we will see you next time with more of this wonderful story. Bye, everyone!